Alright, to this point, all I have done is I've plugged everything up, and I've had it turned on for probably about 5-10 minutes or so, and every once in a while I would come in and just do some standard talking and pushing the button, letting it go type stuff. Nothing too strenuous, just kind of letting it get warmed up a little bit. And now what I'm going to do is basically start talking, and I'm going to randomly push and unpush the button, sometimes holding it for a while, sometimes releasing it real short after I talk, and quick bursts, just different kinds of stuff, and we'll create the DSP.
Alright, here we go. Test, test, test. Test, test, test. 1, 2.
Test, test, test. And notice I'm still talking.
Test, test. 1, 2, 3. Test, test, test. Release the button. Talk, talk, talk. Test, test.
1, 2. Test, test, test.
Keep talking. Push, push, push. Talk, talk, talk. 1, 2, 3.
Test, 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 test.
1, 2, 3. Test, test. Push.
Talk, talk,
talk, talk, talk, talk, talk,
talk, talk, talk.
talk. Push, push.
Rapid push, rapid push, rapid push,
rapid push,
rapid push.
And now we're just going to talk for a while. Talk, 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 talk. 1, 2, 3, test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3, release, and we'll go into a rapid push after this and continue the talk. 1, 2, test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3, test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3, test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3, test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3, test, test. 1, 2, 3. Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3, test, 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 test. 1, 2, test, test, test. 1, 2, 3, test, 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 test. Talk, 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 talk. 1, 2, 3, test, 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 test. Talk, 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 test. Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3. Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3. Test, 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 1, 2, 3. Test, 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 1, 2, 3. Test, 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 1, 2, 3. Talk, 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 test, 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 talk, 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 test, 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 talk, 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 talk. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick up the box and just kind of hold it, move it around a little bit. Not sure if this has any impact or not, but it seems like I can create it sometimes when I'm holding it, sometimes when I'm not, so I'll just hold it and see if it happens. Test, 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 1, 2, 3, test, 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 1, 2, 3, test, 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 1, 2, 3, test, 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 1, 2, test, 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 1, 2, 3, test, 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 1, 2, 3, test, 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 rapid push, rapid push, test, 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 talk, 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 test, 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 1, 2, 3, test, 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 1, 2, 3, test, 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 1, 2, 3, 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 test, 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 talk, 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 release and talk, 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 1, 2, 3, test, 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 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, test, 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 talk, 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 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, test, 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 1, 2, 3, test, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, test, 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 talk, 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 test, 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 talk, 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 test, 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 talk, 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 test, 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 1, 2, 3, keep on testing, 1, 2, 3, talking, 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 testing, pushing, pushing, releasing, pushing, 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 pushing. Talk, talk,
talk, talk, talk, talk,
talk, talk, talk. Test, 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 test. Testing. Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3. Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3. Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3. Talk, talk, talk. Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3. Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3.
Keep on talking, 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 talking.
Test, 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 test.
1, 2, 3. Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3. Test, test, test,
Test, test, test.
test, test. 1, 2, 3.
Doing different kinds of
Talking,
and keeping talking, talking, pushing, talking, talking, pushing, pushing,
pushing,
pushing, pushing,
pushing,
push, push, push. Talk, 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 talk,
talk, talk, talk, talk,
talk, talk, talk, talk, talk. Talk, 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 talk. Talk, 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 talk. Talk, 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 talk. Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. Usage, 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 usage. Tongue twister. And just keep pushing and using and talking and talking and releasing and talking and pushing and talking and talking and talking. Test, 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 testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 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 talking, testing, talking, testing, talking, test, 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 test. Now we're just gonna do some pushing without talking. Test, 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 test,
Talking.
Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing. Talk. Talking, testing.
test. Yep, there it is. And there it is. So it's just kind of, this one took a while. This was probably the longest it's taken me to do it, but yeah, if you mess with it enough, it will happen. And like I said, it happens every time I troop, and when I'm trooping, I'm not pushing the button rapid fast like that. So yeah, I wish, I don't know. I don't know what's causing it. I don't know if it's just a certain amount of time being on that causes it or something, but I don't know. Maybe it could. I don't know if you can maybe check amp volume, because halfway through, I don't know if you saw, but I did reach over and turned up the amp a little bit. So that may have something to do with it, with how loud the amp is. Yeah. One thing I will show you is that if you unplug the push-to-talk, that DSP is still on, so the only way to actually stop it is to unplug it from the amp itself. Hopefully this helps recreate it. Basically, I would suggest just hooking it up, turning it on, cranking up the amp as loud as you can, as loud as you can take it, and just use it normally for a good 15 minutes. And if it doesn't occur when you're, using it normally, walking around with it, then go to some more aggressive methods like the rapid push. If you go to the more aggressive methods like the rapid push, then it will definitely occur. So it's almost like somehow there's getting a current stuck in here, and it just can't get out, because if you notice, even after that static burst pops, that light doesn't go off. That light is now constantly on. Like that current's just in there, stuck. So, alright, hopefully that helps.